Picture this. The camera rises out of deep green, not turquoise. Dominica is not your flat resort postcard Caribbean. The Kalinago called her Waitukubuli, tall is her body. A mountain pulled straight out of the Atlantic and dropped between Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Lesser Antilles. It is dawn. Mist sits low on Morne Diablotin. Rivers are already rushing, and somewhere on the east coast, the Kalinago territory is waking up. One of the last indigenous homelands in the Caribbean that empire never fully wiped off the map. Cut to a brittle old European map. The word Tartary splashed vaguely across half of Asia, and down here in the Caribbean, Dominica stamped with a neat little Latin tag. Dominica, the Sunday Island, because Columbus spotted it on a Sunday in November 1493, and apparently thought looking at something from a ship counted as ownership. Slide in a line from a later observer, Niccolò Silazio, who wrote that Dominica must be seen to be believed. Mountains, verdure, too dramatic to be real. Spoiler: Europeans saw it, believed it, and immediately tried to monetize it. Now drop the beat. Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748. On paper, Britain and France agree that Dominica and a few other islands will stay neutral and reserved to the indigenous Kalinago forever. In practice, forever expires the moment sugar profits look too good to resist. The camera pulls back to a modern ridge, cloud curling over the tree line. That ridge has watched 5 centuries of people fight over this island. It is not done watching yet. Long before any European sail appeared on the horizon, Dominica was already fully inhabited and networked into the wider Caribbean world. The Kalinago, and before them, Arawak-speaking peoples who had migrated northward through the island chain from South America, had built communities along the rivers, ridges, and coastal villages of this vertical island for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests human habitation stretching back at least 2,000 years, with successive waves of settlement bringing different languages, technologies, and social structures to these shores. Daily life centered on the rhythms of agriculture and the sea. Kalinago communities cultivated cassava, sweet potatoes, and other root crops in forest clearings, using sophisticated techniques adapted to the steep terrain. They fished from canoes carved from single massive gommier trees, vessels large enough to carry dozens of people across open water to neighboring islands for trade, diplomacy, or war. They knew which plants healed fevers, which could poison arrow tips, which could be woven into baskets that would last generations. They maintained ridgeline trails connecting settlements across terrain so steep that later colonizers would call it impassable. These paths followed the contours of the land with an intimacy that could only come from centuries of use. Knowledge passed from generation to generation about where to cross rivers safely, where landslides threatened, where freshwater springs could sustain travelers. Those same trails, stitched together centuries later, now form the Waitukubuli National Trail, 184 kilometers of path that modern hikers walk without realizing they are following routes that Kalinago traders and later Maroon escapees used to move silently across the island. The name Waitukubuli fits the landscape perfectly. Tall is her body. Dominica rises sharply from the sea, all volcanic peaks, plunging ravines, and rivers that roar after every rainfall. The island hosts 9 active volcanoes, including the Boiling Lake, the second largest hot spring in the world, where geothermal activity keeps water at near boiling temperatures in a flooded fumarole surrounded by clouds of steam. This was not gentle terrain for agriculture or military conquest. It was terrain that favored people who knew it intimately and punished those who did not. Early missionary and travel accounts describe the Caribs in terms dripping with European fear and fantasy. Fierce, cannibalistic, untamable savages who ate their enemies and terrorized peaceful neighbors. Modern Kalinago scholarship has spent decades unpacking those stereotypes, revealing instead communities with sophisticated political structures, extensive inter-island trade networks, and a fierce commitment to autonomy that would frustrate colonial ambitions for centuries. The very word cannibal derives from Spanish misunderstandings of the name Kalinago, a linguistic slander that became embedded in European languages. If you are looking for a blank canvas for empire, Dominica is the wrong island, and the mountains are about to prove it. On Sunday, November 3rd, 1493, Christopher Columbus's fleet spotted a rugged island rising from the Caribbean Sea during his second voyage to what Europeans were just beginning to call the New World. The sensory scene is easy to imagine. Spanish ships in early morning light, sails catching the trade winds, the smell of salt and tar and unwashed sailors, and ahead, a coastline that offered nothing convenient for the colonial enterprise. Steep cliffs plunged directly into churning surf. Rivers carved deep ravines into mountainsides covered in impenetrable green. There were no obvious harbors where ships could anchor safely, no gentle beaches for landing boats and supplies, no flat coastal plains suitable for the plantation agriculture that would later define Caribbean colonization. Columbus named the island Dominica, the Sunday Island, for the day of its sighting, and sailed on without attempting a serious landing. His log references the sighting briefly, more interested in describing islands that seemed easier to exploit. Later, European writers would describe Dominica's inaccessibility with something between frustration and awe, noting that even approaching the coast required navigating treacherous waters and finding the few spots where landing was possible. The branding department, however, was already working overtime. On European maps, Dominica was filed under assets, claimed, named, and catalogued, even though nobody from the expedition had set foot inland to verify what actually existed there or who already lived on it. The Spanish claimed sovereignty over territories they had never explored, based on papal bulls that divided the entire non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. It was imperialism by paperwork, conquest by cartography. This early label of too difficult had an accidental consequence that would shape the island's history for centuries. While other Caribbean islands were rapidly colonized, deforested, and transformed into sugar factories within decades of European contact, Dominica remained on the margins of imperial interest. The Spanish moved on to easier targets. The English and French, when they arrived in the region, initially focused on flatter, more accessible islands. The pause button on conquest did something rare in Caribbean history. It bought time. Time for Kalinago communities to observe what was happening on neighboring islands. The epidemics, the enslavement, the destruction, and prepare their defenses. Time for the island's reputation as unconquerable to solidify among European mariners who traded stories in port taverns. Time for the terrain itself to become an ally of everyone who would later resist empire. A maze of mountains and rivers that could swallow armies whole. Europe clocked the island, shrugged, and moved on to easier pickings. But the pause was not permanent. It was merely a delay before the inevitable assault. For 2 centuries after Columbus sailed past, Dominica occupied an unusual position in Caribbean geopolitics. Technically claimed by European powers, practically controlled by nobody except the Kalinago who had always lived there. Throughout the 17th century, as English, French, and Dutch colonizers carved up the Caribbean, Kalinago warriors mounted sustained resistance across the Lesser Antilles, They raided colonial settlements, rescued enslaved Africans, and made the cost of occupation painfully high on island after island. Dominica served as a central stronghold in this resistance network, a place where fighters could retreat, regroup, and launch new operations against colonial outposts on neighboring islands. The terrain that Europeans found militarily inconvenient was home ground for communities who knew every river crossing, every mountain pass, every cave where fighters could disappear and wait out pursuing soldiers. Colonial militias that ventured inland found themselves ambushed in ravines, picked off by archers who seemed to materialize from the forest itself, and ultimately defeated by an enemy who refused to stand and fight on European terms. Then came the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. Britain and France, exhausted by yet another European war that had spilled across their colonial possessions, agreed to designate Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Tobago as neutral islands reserved for the Kalinago forever. The treaty language was remarkably clear for a diplomatic document. These islands would not be colonized. Their indigenous inhabitants would be left in peace, and both European powers would refrain from establishing settlements. In practice, forever meant until we change our minds. French missionaries and planters were already slipping onto Dominica's coasts, even as the treaty ink dried, testing how far neutral could stretch before anyone in Europe noticed or cared. The priest Jean-Baptiste Labat, who traveled through the region in the early 1700s, left detailed accounts of both Kalinago life and French colonial ambitions, describing indigenous communities with something approaching respect while simultaneously noting opportunities for French expansion. Small French settlements took root along the leeward coast, growing coffee and provisions, trading with Kalinago neighbors when convenient and encroaching on their land when possible. Colonial officials in Martinique looked the other way. The treaty existed on paper in European archives. The reality on the ground was gradual, steady encroachment. On European paper, the island belonged to the Kalinago. On European ships, ink was already drying on plans to ignore that inconvenient arrangement. The treaties said neutral. The sugar lobby heard not yet. By the mid-18th century, the fiction of neutrality collapsed under the weight of sugar profits and imperial competition. French planters had been establishing coastal estates since the early 1700s, growing coffee and cacao in Dominica's fertile volcanic soil. The settlements were technically illegal under international treaty, but colonial powers had long since learned that possession mattered more than paperwork. When the 7 Years' War reshuffled European colonial possessions across the globe, Britain captured Dominica in 1761 and formalized control through the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The island that had been too rugged to bother with was suddenly prime real estate. British officials arriving to take possession found French plantations already operating, enslaved Africans already laboring in the fields, and a colonial infrastructure that simply needed new flags and new account books. British and French reports from this period reveal the shift in imperial thinking. Officials praised the island's agricultural potential. The soil was rich, the rainfall abundant, the rivers powerful enough to drive sugar mills. In the same documents, they complained bitterly about two persistent problems that made Dominica different from other Caribbean possessions: runaway slaves who disappeared into the mountains, and Caribs who refused to accept that their homeland had been signed away in European treaties. The Kalinago had not disappeared simply because diplomatic agreements said the island was no longer theirs. They had retreated to the eastern coast and the mountain interior, maintaining communities that colonial administrators could not effectively govern, and enslaved Africans, imported in growing numbers to work the new plantations, quickly discovered what the Kalinago already knew. Those mountains offered refuge that flat islands like Barbados could never provide. A British governor wrote to London describing his frustration in terms that revealed the limits of colonial control. Planters held barely a strip of coastline, while the interior remained beyond effective administration. Military expeditions into the mountains returned empty-handed or did not return at all. The same terrain that had delayed colonization for centuries now sheltered everyone who refused to submit to it. By the time empire finally committed to Dominica, thousands of Africans were arriving in chains at coastal ports, and thousands were already calculating escape routes into hills that European soldiers feared to enter. The plantation machine was being assembled on familiar Caribbean lines, but it was being built at the edge of a jungle that had its own ideas about who belonged there. The plantation economy that took root on Dominica's coasts followed the familiar Caribbean template: sugar, coffee, brutality, profit, and the absolute dehumanization of African people reduced to property on accounting ledgers. Estates like Hillsborough spread across the narrow coastal plains, their boundaries marked by cane fields, boiling houses where sugar was processed at temperatures that maimed workers regularly, and the cramped quarters where enslaved people lived under constant surveillance. Plantation registers from this period, dry columns of names, ages, and African origins, document a population that was overwhelmingly black, brought to the island against their will from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, and Angola, to generate wealth for investors who would never see the Caribbean. The work was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Sugar cultivation and processing killed people at rates that required constant importation of new enslaved workers to maintain production. The labor was dangerous, the hours endless, the punishments savage. Planters operated with near-total legal authority over the people they claimed to own, and they used that authority to enforce discipline through violence that was systematic, documented, and profitable. But Dominica's plantations faced a problem their counterparts on flatter islands did not: geography as resistance. On Barbados or Antigua, there was nowhere to run. The islands were small, flat, and thoroughly controlled. Every acre mapped, every road patrolled, every coastline watched. An enslaved person who escaped would be recaptured within days, punished as an example, and returned to labor. On Dominica, the plantation zone was a narrow strip squeezed between the sea and mountains that rose almost vertically into cloud forest and volcanic wilderness. An enslaved person who reached the tree line could disappear into a maze of ravines, rivers, and ridges that plantation militias could not navigate. The forest provided food, water, shelter, and invisibility. Colonial reports from the late 18th century are filled with complaints about runaways who vanished into the interior and were never recaptured despite rewards offered for their return. Some of those escapees followed trails that Kalinago communities had maintained for centuries, paths invisible to European eyes but clear to anyone who knew where to look. The same routes now form segments of the Waitukubuli National Trail, walked by tourists who rarely consider their origin. The planters tried everything: whips, laws, bounty hunters, militias, dogs trained to track human scent. The landscape answered with silence, mist, and ravines that swallowed pursuit. In the mountains above the plantations, a different society was forming, one that colonial authorities could describe but never destroy. Historian Thomson Fontaine's research on Dominica's Maroons describes communities of escaped Africans who did not merely hide in the forest waiting to be recaptured. They built lives there. They established camps with gardens growing provisions that could sustain communities through seasons. They created lookout points on ridges where sentries could spot approaching militias hours before they arrived. They developed defensive positions in ravines where a handful of fighters could hold off much larger forces. These were not random fugitives surviving hand-to-mouth in the wilderness. They were organized communities with leadership structures, spiritual practices brought from Africa and adapted to Caribbean conditions, and intelligence networks that tracked plantation militia movements with remarkable accuracy. They knew when soldiers were coming before the soldiers knew themselves. British colonial correspondence from the late 18th century reveals official frustration bordering on panic. One report admitted what planters did not want London to know. Effective British control extended barely 2 miles inland from the coast. Beyond that invisible line, the interior belonged to Maroons who moved freely, cultivated freely, and lived outside the slave system that was supposed to be absolute. Some scholars describe this as an African state of Dominica, not a formal government with written constitutions and recognized borders, but a functioning territory controlled by black communities who had rejected slavery and held their ground through force of arms, knowledge of terrain, and sheer determination to remain free. Maroon raids on coastal plantations were not random violence or desperate theft. They were strategic operations with clear objectives, liberating enslaved people who wanted to escape, seizing supplies and weapons, and demonstrating that planter control was an illusion that ended at the tree line. The raids kept planters in a state of permanent anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come or which of their enslaved workers was secretly in contact with the mountain communities. The British eventually negotiated treaties with some Maroon leaders. Formal agreements that acknowledged Maroon territories, guaranteed non-interference, and established protocols for returning certain categories of escapees. These treaties look less like military victories and more like reluctant recognition that the mountains could not be conquered by force. On European maps, Dominica was a British colony. On the ground, the center of the island was a black-lead territory that empire could not penetrate. On August 1, 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act transformed every enslaved person in the British Caribbean into an apprentice. The word was a masterpiece of imperial euphemism, designed to make continued exploitation sound like education. Apprentices were legally no longer property, a significant change that cannot be dismissed. But they were required to continue working for their former owners for years without meaningful wages. Field workers faced 6 years of apprenticeship. Domestic servants faced 4. The system preserved plantation labor while allowing Britain to claim moral progress and deflect abolitionist criticism. In Dominica, stipendiary magistrates arrived from Britain to oversee the transition, theoretically protecting apprentices from the abuse that everyone knew would continue under different names. These magistrates were supposed to adjudicate disputes between former owners and former property, ensuring that the new system operated fairly. In practice, the power imbalance remained overwhelming. Planters still controlled the land where apprentices lived. They controlled access to housing, to provision grounds, to the basic necessities of survival. They controlled the work assignments and the schedules. Former enslaved people controlled only their own labor, which the apprenticeship system was specifically designed to continue extracting for planter benefit. Documentary records from this period capture negotiations that were really confrontations dressed in legal language. Apprentices demanded limits on working hours that planters had no intention of respecting. They protested punishments that magistrates were often unwilling to prevent. They calculated exactly how many more years, months, and days until they could finally walk away from estates they had worked their entire lives. The dream that sustained people through these grinding years was land. Owning even a small plot of ground meant independence from the plantation system. Growing your own food, building your own house, working your own schedule, answering to no overseer or magistrate or planter. Some apprentices saved every penny they could earn through extra labor toward that goal. Others planned to claim provision grounds they had cultivated during slavery. Others simply waited for August 1st, 1838, when the apprenticeship system finally ended. Empire had rebranded slavery as a training program for freedom and hoped nobody would notice that the training looked exactly like slavery, with a 4-year countdown clock. Dominicans noticed. They counted every day. Freedom came with fine print. But the people who had survived slavery were already experts at reading between the lines and rewriting the terms when they could. 3 years before formal emancipation, Dominica's political landscape shifted in ways that alarmed the colonial establishment and hinted at futures that planters desperately wanted to prevent. The Brown Privilege Bill of 1831 extended voting rights and eligibility for elected office to free people of color who met property qualifications. This was not emancipation. The enslaved remained enslaved, but it cracked open a door that had been sealed since the colony's founding. Free black and mixed-race Dominicans who had accumulated property could now participate in the political system that governed their lives. After emancipation in 1838, as the formerly enslaved population gained economic footing through land purchase and independent farming, Dominica became the first British Caribbean colony where non-white legislators controlled the House of Assembly. Black and mixed-race representatives outnumbered white planters in the elected chamber that made local laws. The implications terrified the colonial establishment. Letters to London described the situation in apocalyptic terms. Too much democracy, the wrong people voting, the natural order of colonial society inverted. British governors found themselves dealing with an elected body that did not automatically defer to planter interests or rubber stamp policies designed to keep black Dominicans as a dependent labor force. Free black legislators pushed for policies that benefited small farmers over large estates, taxation schemes that did not fall disproportionately on the poor, land policies that made purchase possible for people without inherited wealth, education funding that had never existed under planter control. They challenged the assumption that colonial governance existed to serve planters first and everyone else not at all. The colonial response followed predictable lines: pressure for crown colony status, which would replace elected government with direct rule from London administered by appointed officials. Planters who had once championed local autonomy against imperial interference suddenly discovered the virtues of imperial authority, when that authority could be used to override black political power. Dominica did not wait for the 20th century to experiment with multiracial democracy. It tried it in the 1830s and 1840s under Empire, with Empire watching nervously and shopping for ways to shut the experiment down. The struggle between elected representation and colonial control would continue for decades, with advances and retreats, gains and losses. But the precedent was established. Black Dominicans had demonstrated that political power, once claimed, would not be easily surrendered. By the late 19th century, the plantation economy that had justified so much violence was collapsing under forces that no colonial policy could control. Global sugar prices fell as European beet sugar flooded markets that had once paid premium prices for Caribbean cane. The technological and economic advantages that had made Caribbean sugar profitable were eroding year by year. Estates that had generated fortunes for absentee owners became financial liabilities, their revenues declining while the costs of labor, now theoretically free and expecting wages, continued to rise. The planter class that had once dominated Dominica politically, economically, and socially found itself squeezed between falling commodity prices and a labor force that no longer had to accept whatever terms were offered. Formerly enslaved people and their descendants had options that slavery had denied. They could refuse plantation wages, purchase land, grow provisions for local markets, and build lives entirely outside the estate system. In the vacuum left by plantation decline, a new class emerged and solidified. Small farmers purchased plots wherever they could afford them, often marginal land that planters considered worthless, but land nonetheless. They grew food for their families and neighbors. They raised livestock. They participated in local markets. They built churches and schools and community institutions that had nothing to do with plantation hierarchies. Colonial reports from this period drip with contempt and frustration. Officials complained about insolent peasants who refused plantation wage labor when they could survive independently. They blamed lazy natives for economic conditions created by global commodity markets they did not understand and could not control. Labor protests flared across the Caribbean in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as workers demanded better wages, better conditions, and political representation. Dominica saw its share of unrest, strikes, tax resistance, public demonstrations that colonial authorities described as riots. Newspapers that officials labeled seditious circulated ideas about workers' rights, political organization, and the illegitimacy of colonial rule. A smallholder farmer from this era inhabited multiple worlds simultaneously: Sunday church services, political meetings in village yards, the constant calculations of making a living from difficult land, and the growing sense that the colonial system that had shaped everything was neither permanent nor legitimate. By the time the 20th century arrived, Dominica's real power base was no longer in planter great houses. It was in village yards and roadside meetings where people gathered to discuss how to claim the future. In 1903, the British colonial government did something that acknowledged what 4 centuries of colonialism had failed to erase. Indigenous people still lived on the island they had never left. The establishment of the Carib Reserve, later renamed the Kalinago Territory, on Dominica's rugged east coast, formally recognized indigenous land rights in a Caribbean context where most indigenous communities had been destroyed, displaced, or absorbed beyond recognition. The Kalinago had survived Spanish contact, French missionaries, British administration, and the tsunami of plantation slavery that had transformed the demography of every neighboring island. This survival was not accidental. It resulted from strategic choices made across generations: when to fight, when to negotiate, when to retreat into terrain that colonizers could not effectively control. The same mountains that sheltered Maroon communities had sheltered Kalinago communities for centuries before the first African arrived in chains. Life in the territory was never easy, and official recognition did not mean official support. The land was steep, the soil difficult, the economic opportunities limited. Kalinago communities maintained traditional crafts, the intricate basket weaving and canoe building that had sustained their ancestors, alongside farming, fishing, and whatever wage labor could be found. They navigated relationships with Catholic missions that sought their conversion, colonial administrators who mostly ignored them, and the broader Dominican society that often treated them as historical relics rather than living communities with rights and futures. But survival itself was the most profound form of resistance. Every Kalinago child born in the territory was proof that colonialism had not achieved what it intended. Every traditional skill passed from grandmother to granddaughter was a defeat for policies of erasure that had succeeded almost everywhere else in the Caribbean. The fact that modern Dominica can market itself as the nature island using Kalinago names, Kalinago heritage, and Kalinago imagery is only possible because those communities refused disappearance. The Waitukubuli Trail carries an indigenous name because indigenous people insisted on being remembered and did the work of remembering when no one else would. In 2022, Sylvanie Burton became president of Dominica, a Kalinago woman holding the highest ceremonial office in a nation built on land her ancestors had never voluntarily ceded. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Empires came and went. The people they tried to write out of history now sign the official documents. The path from colony to nation wound through decades of negotiation, frustration, and the larger currents of Caribbean decolonization that reshaped the region after World War II. The West Indies Federation, launched in 1958 as an ambitious attempt to unite British Caribbean territories under a single federal government, collapsed just 4 years later when Jamaica and Trinidad, the largest and wealthiest members, withdrew to pursue independence separately. Smaller islands like Dominica, which had invested hope in federation as a path to viable sovereignty, were left to find their own ways forward with fewer resources and less international leverage. On March 1, 1967, Dominica became a West Indies associated state, a constitutional status that granted control over internal affairs, while Britain retained authority over defense and foreign policy. It was autonomy with an asterisk, sovereignty with training wheels, independence with strings firmly attached. The negotiations that led to full independence on November 3, 1978, involved local politicians navigating between their constituents' aspirations and Britain's conditions. Debates about economic viability that echoed colonial-era arguments about whether small islands could survive alone, and the hard math of what independence would actually cost and who would pay. Dominica was small, just over 70,000 people at independence, mountainous, and dependent on banana exports to markets controlled by former colonial powers under preferential trade agreements that could be withdrawn at any time. Independence meant a flag and an anthem and a seat at the United Nations, and the right to make decisions without asking London's permission. It did not mean escape from the economic structures that centuries of colonialism had built into the island's foundations. After centuries of being traded in European treaties like a chess piece, neutral, then French, then British, then associated, now independent, Dominica finally walked off the board entirely. But the old players still controlled the banks that held Dominican debt, the markets that bought Dominican exports, and the international institutions that set the rules of the game. Independence changed what was legally possible. It did not automatically change what was economically practical. The same terrain that had sheltered Maroons now constrained agricultural development. The same isolation that had preserved indigenous culture limited access to global markets. Flags and anthems changed in a single ceremony. Debt, trade dependency, and climate vulnerability operated on entirely different timelines. In September 2017, Hurricane Maria made landfall on Dominica as a Category 5 storm, the strongest hurricane to strike the island in recorded history. The damage approached totality. Forests that had stood for centuries were stripped of every leaf. The Green Mountains turned brown overnight. Roads were buried under landslides. Bridges were swept away by rivers that had become torrents. The electricity grid was destroyed. The water system failed. Houses lost roofs, walls, everything. The agricultural sector, already fragile, already dependent on bananas that faced uncertain futures in changing global markets, was devastated completely. The cost of rebuilding exceeded the nation's entire annual GDP. International aid arrived, but international aid comes with conditions, timelines, and the politics of donor countries that have their own priorities. Maria exposed vulnerabilities that had roots reaching back centuries into colonial history. An economy built around export crops rather than local food security. Infrastructure concentrated along vulnerable coasts because that was where plantations had been, and plantations had shaped everything that came after. Dependence on foreign aid and foreign markets with their own agendas. The same patterns that plantation agriculture had established. Extraction for external benefit, infrastructure serving export rather than local needs, vulnerability to forces beyond local control, echoed in the structure of disaster and recovery. But something else emerged from the destruction, something that Maria could damage but not destroy. Memory, persistence, and paths through the mountains. The Waitukubuli National Trail suffered extensive damage. Sections washed away by landslides, bridges destroyed, markers lost, but the paths themselves remained, traced into the landscape by centuries of use. The trail stitches together routes that Kalinago traders walked before Columbus arrived, paths that Maroons used to move silently across the island beyond colonial surveillance. Tracks that small farmers followed to markets in distant villages when there were no roads. Return to that ridge where we started. Mist over Morne Diablotin, rivers cutting through valleys, the morning light catching the green that defines this island even when storms strip it bare. 5 centuries of history are layered into this landscape like sediment, each era leaving traces that the next could not completely erase. Kalinago settlements occupied these valleys before any European ship appeared on the Atlantic horizon. Picture this. The camera rises out of deep green, not turquoise. Dominica is not your flat resort postcard Caribbean. The Kalinago called her Waitukubuli, tall is her body. A mountain pulled straight out of the Atlantic and dropped between Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Lesser Antilles. It is dawn. Mist sits low on Morne Diablotin. Rivers are already rushing, and somewhere on the east coast, the Kalinago territory is waking up. One of the last indigenous homelands in the Caribbean that empire never fully wiped off the map. Cut to a brittle old European map. The word Tartary splashed vaguely across half of Asia, and down here in the Caribbean, Dominica stamped with a neat little Latin tag. Dominica, the Sunday Island, because Columbus spotted it on a Sunday in November 1493 and apparently thought looking at something from a ship counted as ownership. Slide in a line from a later observer, Niccolo Silazio, who wrote that Dominica must be seen to be believed. Mountains, verdure, too dramatic to be real. Spoiler: Europeans saw it, believed it, and immediately tried to monetize it. Now drop the beat. Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748. On paper, Britain and France agree that Dominica and a few other islands will stay neutral and reserved to the indigenous Kalinago forever. In practice, forever expires the moment sugar profits look too good to resist. The camera pulls back to a modern ridge, cloud curling over the tree line. That ridge has watched 5 centuries of people fight over this island. It is not done watching yet. Long before any European sail appeared on the horizon, Dominica was already fully inhabited and networked into the wider Caribbean world. The Kalinago, and before them, Arawak-speaking peoples who had migrated northward through the island chain from South America, had built communities along the rivers, ridges, and coastal villages of this vertical island for centuries.